Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are focused this week on an event that happened on July 8th. 1663 is when Rhode Island got its official charter. And we are using that event to talk not only about Rhode Island, but more specifically about Roger Williams. And as one of the true founders of America and his impact, and particularly how that relates to the idea of the hedge and the separation of church and state. And we are glad to have John Barry with us, who is a great historian and author and has written a book, or wrote a book, I should say, on Roger Williams. So, John, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, tell me a little, how did you get interested in Williams in the first place? Of all the founders and all the people that you could have picked, how did he
Well,
make
it's,
the cut?
I'm actually from Providence.
Ah, no,
Um,
okay.
and people assume that's how I was interested, but it wasn't. That's a coincidence. Um, and it's kind of an odd story. I wanted to write a book about the home front in World War One.
Mhm.
You know, there's a chapter in my book, Rising Tide, about the 27 flood. Chapter 10 talks about everything that was going on during the war, which led to all sorts of things in the 1920s. And I had scoped that out. I knew exactly how I wanted to proceed on that book. And I had identified several figures I was going to follow. One of them was Billy Sunday, who
Huh,
was the
okay.
first evangelist who really got involved in politics.
Hmm.
And just doing my due diligence, looking at the history of, you know, a religion and politics in the United States, I went back to Roger Williams and John Winthrop. Uh, and that relationship and that story seemed so good, I abandoned the idea of writing about the home front in World War One. Went back several hundred years to the early 1600s.
Wow.
Winthrop, was the one who gave the sermon on the way to America, called by the New York Times the greatest sermon in 1,000 years, in which he first used the phrase, we are to be a city on a hill.
Mhm.
Reagan, of course, changed that to we are shining city on a hill, which is actually not Winthrop's words. And Winthrop and Williams were actually, Williams almost saw Winthrop as a father figure.
Wow.
But in theologically, there was no distance between them. Williams was a Puritan, and there was a great deal of discrimination, actually persecution, of
Mhm.
Puritans by the king, uh, and which ultimately led to a civil war and the beheading of the king and the beheading of an archbishop. So the Puritans had fled England, not for religious freedom, but for the freedom to practice their religion as they wanted. Nobody else was going to get any freedom. And as I say, Williams and Winthrop, no distance between them theologically. But Williams arrived in Boston, was offered uh, pastorship of the church in Boston, which was the premier post of its kind at the time. And he declined it because they weren't pure enough for him.
Mhm.
He ended up going to Salem. The real difference between, uh, well, let me back up a second. One of the interesting things of it, Williams is very well known as the author of the phrase, the wall of separation between
Mhm.
church and state, and the whole concept of separation of church and state. What people don't recognize is that he was mentored by Sir Edward Coke, who's probably the greatest judge in English history. He was Chief Justice of England. Unless you're a lawyer, you never heard of Edward Coke. but every American over the age of 5 probably knows his most famous ruling from the bench, that the house of everyone is as his castle. So obviously today we know that is every man's home is his castle.
Mhm.
And the idea was that you were free to do what you wanted in your own home. And Cook also defied the king. The king threw him in the Tower of London. Cook's response is, if the king desires my head, he knows where he may find it. So Williams had this
Mhm.
sense of individual freedom that was part of his whole sense of being. Uh, he also thought there was the possibility of being wrong. Uh, there were, he was a scholar. He read the Bible in several languages. There were discrepancies in translations, discrepancies in interpretation. Some of them were pretty significant. They couldn't all be right. So there was always the possibility of error. Uh, Also, in the context, you've got to remember, as I said earlier, the Church of England was moving closer and closer to Catholicism under the king.
Mhm.
They were persecuting Puritans. On the continent of Europe, Christians were murdering Christians because of the way they followed Christ. So he understood that when you mix religion and politics, you get politics. That the church was going to be corrupted by any contact with the state. It wasn't in his idea of freedom of church and state or separation was not because he was an atheist. It was far from it. It was the reverse. It was because he was so devout. He did not believe, he thought any contact between the state and the church would corrupt the church. So, there were a lot of other things about him that were unusual. For example, he thought that Native Americans had every right to their lands,
Mhm.
and that the English couldn't simply take land, they had to buy it from Native Americans. This created quite a bit of conflict for him in the Massachusetts colony. Uh, so he was, somewhat disruptive in Massachusetts. They banished him. They were going to return him to England in the middle of as soon as spring came. And had that happened, he would have been imprisoned. If not, he probably would have died in prison, as a matter of fact. So he fled and ended up founding Rhode Island on the basis of total separation of church and state. In fact, and this is really extraordinary, the founding document for Providence, which actually preceded the charter you were talking about by several decades,
Mhm.
he drafted the founding document. And in one of the drafts, he asked for God's blessing on the effort. But in the final compact, which everybody signed, he eliminated that. He did not ask for God's blessing. And the reason was, again, he considered
Mhm.
any connection between the civil government and the church would corrupt the church. Uh, and frankly, if you look at religion and politics today, that yeah, I think he had something going for him there.
All right, well, let's let's back up to be able to tell us more about him personally, about his life and kind of how did he uh, where did he grow up? What was his background?
Well,
How was it?
he grew up in London.
Okay.
We think he was born in 1603. We're not certain of that. Uh, you know, when he was about 13, he became an amanuensis to Cook, whom I mentioned. The only thing he ever said about his father was that he was persecuted in and out of his father's house these many years. He
Hmm.
obviously didn't get along with his father, whether that was a personality clash or whether that had to do with his developing ideas about the churches. It's unclear. Uh, he actually referred to Cook as, at some point he said, how many thousand times have I thought of the example of Cook's courage, I cited earlier, and he really saw Cook somewhat as a father figure. Um, he learned Algonquin, the Native American language, was probably certainly one of, and arguably the most fluent Englishman in New England in Native American language. He traded with them. Uh, he got the land for Rhode Island from members of the chief of the Narragansett tribe. On several occasions, when Massachusetts threatened Rhode Island, with Massachusetts was obviously much more developed, much bigger, and so forth, he went back to England to get protection. And one of those, he was a friend of Oliver Cromwell.
Okay.
He taught John Milton Dutch. Uh, he had written a dictionary of translating English into Algonquin, which actually made him a bit of a, and it's a very interesting document, even reading it today, because it's more of a sociological description of Native Americans. And that actually, he got that published in England on his first trip back, and that made him a bit of a celebrity in England. And give you a sense of his idea of, he certainly tried to convert Indians to Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
but he said, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. He felt it had to be voluntary. When Massachusetts was trying to pressure Native Americans to convert, they actually got in touch with Williams in England. Williams went to Cromwell, and Cromwell ordered Massachusetts to stop. Cromwell was probably the only person in the world the Puritans in Massachusetts were afraid of,
Mm.
and they did stop. So again, that sense of it has to be God has to be in your heart. Uh, no hypocrisy. Uh, One of the other interesting things about Williams is even his most bitter enemies, who opposed everything that he stood for, liked him.
Ah,
He was just, apparently a really nice guy. Uh, and back to religious freedom, Massachusetts was whipping Quakers
right.
and actually hanging Quakers. They banished them. If they returned after you were banished, you could be executed. And Massachusetts did execute several Quakers. Williams theologically agreed with Massachusetts. He thought Quakers were an abomination, but he's in his late 70s, and instead of trying to use the state power of Rhode Island against the Quakers, he actually takes a canoe and canoes to Newport and debates Quakers who are 30 or 40 years younger than he over a period of a couple of days. You know, uh, so again, it's the voluntarism, the refusal to use the power of the state against how you're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
All that is not only essential to what Williams thought, but I think that's at the basis of the United States. I think it's whether it. I mean, how do I say this better? There's a difference between being a Christian nation and a Christian government.
Mm-hmm.
And Williams would be all for being a Christian nation. But again, the idea of a Christian government, he considered totally wrong and dangerous to the purity of the church.
Yeah, the separation of churches from state was keeping the church from the state. It wasn't. It wasn't
Yeah.
the opposite part of that, right? I mean, so that
Right.
would be. And so, don't you think though that's part? Hey, we're enjoying our conversation we're having with John Barry as we're talking more about Roger Williams. really in context to this whole greater, bigger picture, we hear very often, and I teach this sometimes in my history classes to say, go back and show me this whole idea about how we say that we are this Christian nation. I think it is a nation of people who had Christianity as their basis of what they believed, and that flowed into what would be the government, but not the other way of saying we're chartering it this way, except in places like, Massachusetts Bay Colony or other places like that were. And so it seems to me, at least anyway, and I'm asking and preaching at the same time, it seems to me that Williams is really this example as of not just another guy who founded a colony. I mean, it's really his thought process, his heart process, his willingness to understand, no, this is really what this ought to be about, and this whole separation and how that infiltrated in places when the
Yeah,
founders were all getting together 100 years after him, right?
yeah, you're exactly right. Massachusetts wrote its own constitution, which they called the Body of Liberties, uh, which reads, it was derived from Magna Carta and actually derived from some of Edward Cook's. In fact, Cook wrote, well, what is probably second something called the Petition of Right, which
Mm,
passed Parliament unanimously, both House of Lords and the House of Commons. Uh, it's not really a petition; it's a statement of those rights, which really informed our Bill of Rights, including things like habeas corpus and things like that. But Massachusetts wrote a body of liberties, and then they essentially voided everything they had just written with by adding the language that anything that can be interpreted as contrary to the word of God is also illegal. So, that's obviously
right.
completely open to interpretation and essentially voids everything preceding that in that language of body of liberties.
Mm,
Rhode Island was actually outlawed slavery in the 1660s, although unfortunately that was, not exactly adhered to over a period of time. And in fact, some of the slave dealers, uh, were involved, you know, decades later. They were pretty important. One of them was one of the Brown brothers after, Brown University, where I attended, which incidentally was the first Baptist school in the country.
yeah, right.
Uh, and in fact, I graduated from the First Baptist Church in the country. Uh, Rhode Island, Williams also was a co-founder of that First Baptist Church.
Mhm.
Uh, Although he later left it, he was not a member of any organized group. He believed in Washington. Again, it was such an individual experience, the relationship as he viewed it between an individual and God, that he was worshiping in his own home, and Providence did not get a church for some time.
I mean, he didn't, I mean, so when he came over and was offered this pastorship in Boston, was that as a Puritan
Yes.
church
Oh
congregationalist
yeah.
or
It
as
was
a
kind
Church
of
of
the
England? Okay.
congregation. Yeah.
Okay. So that was, and even as he started in that, I mean, for him to kind of say, I'm true to my word, had he already become a Baptist
No,
as
I
he was
wouldn't
getting
say
ready to
that.
leave when he was kicked out, or not until he was kicked out?
That's a fine point of theology that I is probably above my pay grade.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think so. He was pretty consistent uh, over a period of time, remarkably consistent. Uh, it was he went to Salem, and where the Puritans were even purer than they were in Boston,
Mm,
and he was involved in that church. Uh, he was certainly a leader of that church, uh, but in a less formal way. Uh, he ended at Plymouth, was a separate colony at the time. Uh, he was kicked out of Plymouth also. Uh, Again, largely because he felt that Native Americans had rights. Uh, he was a remarkable man.
Yeah.
The There's a scholar who wrote a history of development of toleration in England, religious toleration in England, a multi-volume history. Uh, and he judged Williams to be the most important person in the entire 17th century, a century which includes John Locke. Uh,
Wow.
and Locke, a lot of Locke's, there are several scholars who look at what Williams wrote and look at what Locke's wrote, and pretty convinced that Locke his views derived largely from Williams. Williams even tolerated Catholics, which was not something that I say even as if it's remarkable, but it's, back then
Right.
for a
Outside of
Puritan,
Maryland, right? You didn't really have a good shot, right? I mean,
yeah, John Locke did not tolerate Catholics. Uh, it's unclear how Williams viewed atheists, but there are, I, he's never said anything explicitly about them, but it seems, at least to me, that he also tolerated atheists, which would certainly not have been the case in England or
oh
Massachusetts or
yeah,
Plymouth.
right, right. So let's talk to maybe a little bit about the founding of the colony itself. When he put his money where his mouth was, literally, right? I mean, he purchased the land from the Narragansett whenever he was setting out what the chart, I mean, what the
Yeah,
actual the charter was going to be, right?
he made a deal. It's not pure. He didn't have much money at that point. He did trade with the Indians. It's not entirely clear whether it was a gift or how much he actually paid
Mm,
them or whether
okay.
he paid them later. Uh, but he didn't simply take it over. He definitely met with the chiefs, a gentleman named Canonicus, uh, who was okay with giving him the land, again, unclear whether it was a gift because of past relationships or whether there was an actual transfer of money.
Well, and didn't the charter, and I should have beefed up on this, but the charter itself kind of went back and forth a while, didn't it? Just because of Cromwell and Charles II coming back in, and then who was in charge and who gave him the politics of being able to create this state and this other
Right.
colony. And I mean, there was even back and forth with a lot of that, right?
Yeah. Well, as I said, he went back to England twice, uh, which is not as uncommon as you might think in terms of people going back and forth to
Hmm.
England from colonial America at that time. You know, it was under Cromwell when he was trying to protect the colony from Massachusetts. The guy, and he stayed for an extended period of time, but the gentleman who actually stuck it out when the Restoration came and got a legal charter from the Crown itself. Earlier, Williams had gotten recognition from Parliament. It's not quite the same as the charter. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, that was a Baptist named John Clark from Newport,
Huh.
who stayed for really several years in England until he could deliver the charter.
Huh. And Providence gets its name as the capital because God in his providence has given them this opportunity.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I remember, if I remember right, there's some great paintings of Williams getting off the boat, right, and shaking the hand of the chief and saying, "Hello, friend," or something like that. That the chief actually said something back in English or
Yeah.
something that he said, "Hey, it's going to be a good deal. This is great, very providential." And I may be stretching the story, okay, in such a way,
Well,
but
that's a story, but I don't think it quite happened. And I know the paintings that you're referring to.
yeah.
Uh, I don't
Well,
know
we
that it
never want the
exactly worked
truth.
that way.
That's right. We never want the truth to get in the way of a good story, right? So I mean, we
That's
don't.
right.
That's about how that
Although, as a historian, I don't even like to joke you about that phrase, although
that's
I've said it myself sometimes.
so his what was the colony like then after Williams died? Is he buried in Rhode Island? Is that where his final spot is to go back to England? I mean, what was his
No,
family life
he
after?
left his family. Well, again, he fled in the middle of a snowstorm. When he found, as I said earlier, Winthrop and he had a relationship. Uh, Massachusetts initially said, okay, we're going to banish you, but it's the middle of the winter. Therefore, you don't have to leave until spring as long as you don't preach.
Hmm.
Uh, and in his own home, he didn't go out into the church and preach. He honored that agreement. But his own home, he would say things, I don't know whether he formed, which was interpreted as preaching by the authorities in Massachusetts. So they said, okay, he's violating, from his perspective, it's in his own home, for
Right.
God's sakes. He can
It's the
say what he
castle doctrine,
wants.
right? Right.
And but from the authorities' perspective, he was violating the agreement. So they actually sent soldiers to put him on a boat to send him back to England in the middle of the winter.
Wow.
Winthrop sent him advance, and Winthrop was governor. Winthrop was a long-term governor of Massachusetts, not
Hmm.
continuously, but with some interruptions. Was probably the most powerful and most respected person in the colony.
Hmm.
And Winthrop warned him that soldiers were about to arrest him
Oh,
and put him
wow.
on a boat back to England. And Williams then fled into a blizzard. Uh, he said Indians saved his life, took care of him during the winter, and eventually he did found Providence. You know, he left his wife and children in Salem, and eventually, of course, they came to Providence. And it's really remarkable how many descendants he's got. I mean, every place. I had a pretty extensive book tour for that book,
Hmm.
and everywhere I went, somebody showed up who said they were a descendant of
Really?
Williams. And there's actually an organization of Williams descendants. Uh,
I would imagine. I mean, I would have led with that had I been one, right? I mean, that'd been something that we certainly like to be able to talk about. Somebody that was that impactful. It's a great story. So tell us uh, uh, where we can find more about the works that you do and the books that you've written and more things that we can learn to be able to follow the good stuff that you've done.
well, I appreciate your asking. Your library or hopefully any bookstore.
Right,
Uh,
right,
You know,
right.
I've written 6 books, and I actually right now, like 2 weeks ago, I sent in the edited manuscript for my next one. I'm awaiting the copy edited manuscript coming back to me in a couple of days, and that will appear in March 2027. It's called Water and Oil.
Huh.
Uh, I know some people will see it as probably a sequel to Rising Tide. I don't see it that way, but you know. We'll see.
All right, fantastic. Well, hey, thank you so much, John, for taking your time to share more with us and our audience from the Center for Christian History to talk more about Roger Williams and his impact, not only on the founding and his activity of the founding at the beginning of this country, but also his long-lasting impact of what he had about the
Yeah,
very core belief that the castle doctrine is not only about you having what's going on in your house, but it's also about what's going on in your heart and your head. And so, if that's, I should be able to have free exercise thereof, right, of
yeah.
religion for that to work.
Well,
So,
it's not an accident that the First Amendment is both free speech and free religion.
mm-mm.
Uh, going back to when Massachusetts banished him, they said you can think whatever you want. It's only if you speak what you're thinking that you're going to be in trouble. So, what good
Right.
is freedom of religion without, or freedom of thinking without
Yeah.
the ability to speak what you believe?
How about that? Fantastic. Thank you again so much for taking time. For those of you who are interested to follow more about what we're doing at the Center for Christian History, follow us on all the regular social spots of where you would see. Hopefully you will follow this podcast as well and give us a good couple of thumbs up rating. That always makes a difference to the things that we're doing. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.